we begin today with a South Florida congressman drawing lines in the sand on other issues.
Carlos Curbelo of Miami, a Republican, says he will not vote for a budget to keep the U.S. government up and running without a permanent protection for dreamers. Those are the young people brought as children to this country by their parents and who stayed and grew up here without legal residency status. Some 30,000 dreamers live, study, work in Florida. On Friday, a group of 19 ended a 5-day hunger strike to bring attention to their cause. They could be deported starting in March unless Congress acts to protect them.
Congressman Carlos Curbelo is the sponsor of the Recognizing Americans Children Act. We know it as RACA. He is a Republican in his second term, representing the 26th District, which is South Miami-Dade all the way to Key West. Good morning.
It's good to be with you. Thank you.
Good to have you.
Great to have you here. All right, on Friday, the House of Representatives kicked the budget can down the road with a continuing resolution to keep government running till December 22nd. You have said at that conference on Tuesday in Coral Gables, you will not vote for a permanent budget until and unless dreamers are protected. Do you stand by that?
I do. And first, let me just say, how unfortunate is it that the greatest enterprise in the world, the largest at least, the United States government, gets funded 2 weeks at a time. This has to stop, separate and apart from the dreamer issue. Now, I've always been one to vote to keep government open. I think that's the normal thing to do. However, I think every so often you really need to take a stand. And this dreamer issue this year is different than in years past. Congress has been debating dreamers for 16 years. Orrin Hatch reminded me he filed the first DREAM Act in 2001. No solutions. So that's why I said this time, though, is different, because the cost of failure means 800,000 lives are at risk. These are young people who are productive for the most part, contributing to this country. I call them Americans because they were raised here, they're culturally competent, they speak perfect English, and all of a sudden they would be jobless and subject to deportation. That we cannot allow.
And to a country that many of them simply don't know, they don't speak the language very well,
right.
If at all. It would be terrible hardship. I just think a lot of people say this would be morally repugnant and against what this country stands for.
So that is why, for the first time, I'm saying I am not going to vote unless we take care of this, which we can. There's a bipartisan majority in both the House and the Senate that believes in solving this issue. On my bill, the Recognizing America's Children Act, we have 35 Republicans on the record saying we want to help these young people. We want them to be able to earn a path to citizenship. They don't get any special privileges. They would have to go into the legal immigration system, but we give them that path so long as they do one of three things: get a college degree, show that they've been working and paying taxes for 4 out of 5 years, or serve in the military. And obviously, if they committed any felony, any string of misdemeanors, they would be ineligible.
You know, so commendable that you draw this line in the sand for something so important. But there are people looking at this kind of thing that Congresspeople do, holding up a vote, especially on government spending, on an issue, as important as the issue may be, holding up government spending for something that really has nothing to do with that. And that's a big question to a lot of people on this particular issue and others.
It was not an easy decision for me, Glenna, because, again, I think the government has to be competent. I think the government shouldn't be funded 2 weeks at a time. Truthfully, this spending issue should have been resolved prior to September 30th, the end of the previous fiscal year. Congress said, our leaders on both parties said we need more time to negotiate a big spending deal. 2 months passed. They have nothing. So now 2 weeks, they're going to try to do something in these next 2 weeks. But again, lives are at risk. For me, this is a very human issue. This is not an ideological issue where I say, well, unless this tax policy passes or not, you know, I'm going to withhold my vote. These are lives that are at risk, and I just think we need to settle this once and for all.
When the president rescinded, essentially, President Obama's executive order for the Dreamers in September, it was just a couple of months ago, so all of these permits that they have start to expire in March. So now that there's this window until March, you know, it was my impression listening to the president that he sort of drew his own line in the sand and said, all right, now you have a time limit, so do something. So it has to be done by March, but theoretically, really in the next 20 days by the end of the year. How likely is it that there will be some kind of legislation, permanent fix passed?
I think we have a 50-50 chance. And let me tell you, with all of the criticism the president gets...
50-50, that's
50-50.
Better than I thought.
With all of the criticism the president gets, and I criticize him more than enough, this idea of forcing Congress to act, I think is good. Because Congress has been punting for years and years and years. Congress has gotten very good at showing what they're against, but not what we're for. And what the president said is, I want a solution from Congress for this issue. Same thing with TPS, by the way. I tell people, this is only a tragedy if Congress fails to act, because the administration, in their statements on these policies, have said Congress should produce a permanent solution.
Yeah, Congressman, let's move on to kind of an ancillary issue, same kind of principle here. Carl Hiaasen, very good column in this morning's Miami Herald, praises you for your opposition to oil exploration drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. However, in the tax reform bill, in the Senate version, I believe, it does allow for oil drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge.
That's right.
What do you get?
The House bill that we passed does not. I have said drilling in Alaska is not a tax issue. We shouldn't even be considering it in a tax overhaul. But there's a very slim margin in the Senate, and Lisa Murkowski is a senator from Alaska who for years has been an advocate of drilling in the Arctic. She says that this plan is very modest, that it wouldn't be disruptive to the wildlife there. Our point is this does not belong in a tax bill. We oppose the drilling there, but even beyond that, this is not an issue that should be considered in the tax bill. So we sign a letter, 12 Republicans in the House, saying we don't like this idea. We are now producing a new letter this week, and this is news, that we are demanding that it be eliminated from the final product that is being worked out in a conference committee now.
How concerned are you that on the other end of the continent, if this goes through, it is a giant slippery slope for opening up offshore drilling in the Gulf, bringing the drilling permits closer to shore?
Yeah, that's a valid argument.
And the keys is your
That's exactly right. But I'm against it even in isolation, and not even considering about what could happen in South Florida. I'm against it. And I will say, when it comes to South Florida, we have strong unity in our delegation opposing any nearshore drilling because we know what the consequences
So if it's in, how do you vote for it? How do you vote for the tax bill if it's
Well, look, in every bill that comes up, especially massive bills like this tax overhaul, like spending bills at the end of the year, you have to really decide what your priorities are. And what I have said is I really don't want any single provision to prevent me from supporting this legislation. You know, I'm a member of the Ways and Means Committee. I worked on this legislation. Right. There's a lot of good in there, from my view, for middle-income families, for the economy, for growth. I'm not going to go out there today and say, if this provision is in there, I'm definitely voting against it. But we are demanding that it be pulled, and we're making it known that it is very important to us.
All right. Well, Congressman, the tax reform bills, the Senate House versions, are different, and you're being reconciled in conference. But let me just ask you, since you are on Ways and Means and you've really worked on this, from my distant point of view, trying to read as much as I can, speak to experts about it, for middle-income Americans, for the first several years, they get a break. Could be between $900 to $2,200 a year, depending on where they fall in the individual tax brackets. But 10 years out, all the economists say most middle-class families are going to see the tax breaks go away, and the tax breaks for the very, very wealthy increase exponentially.
This is a phenomenon that is most evident in the Senate bill. The House bill does have a lot more permanent relief for middle-income and even lower-income families long-term, permanently. The Senate bill, their budget rules are different, so they had to put these gimmicks in the bill, quite frankly. We in conference are insisting on the House position to make the relief for middle-income families permanent. We do that with our child tax credit expansion. The Senate does not.
$2,000?
Well, ours is $1,600, but it's permanent.
Marco
the Senate
Rubio
is
wants
$2,000. It expires. And by the way, Senator Rubio has been adamant about this, and I think he's going to win. I think $2,000 is going to be in the final bill. It's not going to be fully refundable the way he'd like, but it will be in the final bill. I will say this about the provisions on the individual side of the code, the relief for middle-income families and for all American families. The Bush tax cuts were supposed to be temporary, and all of those provisions for non-wealthy Americans were made permanent by President Obama with a Republican House and a Democratic Senate. So, although they are technically temporary, the tradition and the history has been that those provisions that that broadly help Americans usually end up being permanent, even if they're technically temporary in the initial
We'll just
bill.
have to see what comes out of conference. All right. Hold your thoughts. We've got many more questions. Glenna and I for Congressman Carlos Curbelo. Stay with us back after the break.
We are back with Congressman Carlos Curbelo live on so many issues. We can talk about Jerusalem and the Capitol and Venezuela and bump stocks and gun policy, but let's talk about sexual harassment, because that is a
hot topic.
The overarching headlines. 3 of your colleagues resigned. You, as we know, have never been accused of anything remotely like sexual harassment. What do you make of the House right now has a bill about training for sexual harassment. Do you really need training to know what that is?
I think it's important to have systems in place, standards, these types of training sessions, so that at least no one has the excuse that they didn't know or that they were unaware. Here's what I'll say broadly. I think we're going through a cultural revolution. I think it's necessary. There have been too many abuses throughout the years, people looking the other way, or just general acceptance to this type of conduct. In all revolutions, there will be innocent victims. That happens. I'm sure that some people will be falsely accused. The pendulum will have to swing back at some point, and we'll have to find that healthy middle ground where the accused have due process and an ability to defend themselves, and the accusers are treated with respect and taken seriously, which is the first step and which had been absent from Congress. You know, there was a requirement that people who felt like they were sexually harassed had to go to counseling before filing their claims or making their accusations.
Which is
That's
outrageous.
just absurd. And then this secret fund where members had been paying claims with taxpayer dollars, that is unacceptable too. We must put an end to that, and we will. But I think more generally, we have to take a step back and look at the broad societal impacts of what we're going through, accept it because it's good, but also make sure that everyone gets treated fairly.
Your colleague from Texas, Brent Farenthold, says he is going to pay back the $84,000 taxpayer dollars that were paid to a woman whom he sexually harassed. Now, late this week, we have learned that Congressman Alcee Hastings of Miramar, the $220,000 was paid from the U.S. Treasury to a woman who worked for him with the U.S. Commission on Europe that he had chaired at that time. Do you think he should pay that money back?
Well, I don't know about his specific case, but I'll tell you this. The fact that those funds were paid out of the Treasury has raised a lot of questions. We, the U.S. House of Representatives, started looking at this issue a few weeks ago when it first bubbled up, and the chair of the Committee on House Administration came back to us and said there's only been one claim in the last 5 years. It was $84,000, Farenthold, and then we learn of this other claim that apparently was paid out of a different fund. We need to figure out how that happened and why.
Right.
And Congressman Hastings, who, by the way, is a colleague I've been on the show with, and as a member of the Florida delegation, we work closely together on a lot of issues. Of course, he needs to come out and explain what happened and then take appropriate action.
Can I just, while we're on the subject of the payments, excuse me, the Congressional Office of Compliance, according to what we've researched, has paid $17 million in 264 settlements in the last 20 years for sexual harassment claims.
Right. We only look back 5 years because there's a lot of turnover in Congress, and a lot of people have only been there for, in my case, 3 years. But yes, this is something which I think in the past was even more prevalent and common, regrettably. And we're going to have to go back as far as we can. I mean, people who have passed away already, there's really not much we can do, but there has to be a degree of accountability. The secrecy has to go away. Of course, the victims have to be protected. If they don't want to come forward, that is their right. But the accused do need to come out and explain what happened. And if they feel like they were wrongly accused, make that case publicly, and people in each district will decide.
I just want to say on the record that as far as we know, Congressman Hastings has denied sexually harassing anyone, called the charge ludicrous, and we are going to invite him to be on this program.
And was exonerated, to your point.
I'm sorry?
Had been exonerated.
Well, that's what he called it. Yeah, I understand. We must talk about the president's announcement this week recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. You issued a statement saying, well, of course it's the capital of Israel, and no reasonable person knows that it's not. But you know also, of course, that the equilibrium between the Palestinians and the Israelis is so delicate, and it appears that President Trump has put his hand on the scales and said, yeah, we're going with the Israelis on this.
I understand that, Michael, but I commended the president of the administration because I don't think we can be careful with the truth. If we don't accept obvious facts and truths about the Middle East in this case, then I think peace is impossible. I think in order for peace to be possible one day, you have to unmask the reality, let people know what the truth and the facts are,
right,
and then proceed. And for a country like Israel to be denied its capital by the international community, which is obviously its capital. I mean, anyone who knows the Bible knows that Jerusalem's the capital of Israel, of the Jewish people, and of course of the Arabs and Palestinians who live in that city as well. It's a very diverse city.
Right.
But we cannot be careful about the truth. Something else related to that, the Taylor Force Act, which passed the House. For years, the Palestinians have been making payments to the families of those who commit acts of terror. These are rewards that those families receive and that those individuals receive while they're in jail and then, of course, when they come out. And for years, we sat back and we didn't want to recognize that because, well, we don't want to create a difficult situation or raise tensions. But if we look the other way, when these horrible things are happening, I think we're actually complicit in preventing a true peace from emerging from the Middle East. So I think we just need to be clear and honest and proceed with a clear moral compass when it comes to the Middle East.
That said, do you think the United States and President Trump and the art of the deal that he touts has given up a negotiating tool or a tactic by doing this without asking for anything in return?
In terms of the peace process,
yeah,
I never had very much hope for the peace process that this administration or that the previous administration announced. I think a lot of work needs to be done in the Middle East before we can actually even have serious conversations about peace. In the case of Israel and the Palestinians, we first need the Palestinians to agree that the state of Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state, and they need to stop promoting violence in their schools against Jewish people. As long as that's going on, there is not going to be peace in the Middle East, and I think we should be very honest about that.
I don't want this conversation interview to end without getting you to comment on the fact that a couple of weeks ago you had applied months ago to be a member of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, mainly Democrats, I guess exclusively Democrats. You certainly qualify on every level. You are a proud Cuban American, you speak fluent Spanish, and they denied you membership.
Yeah, I tell people that maybe I'm too tall, that's why they didn't let me in, but obviously that's not the case. And look, I think that was actually a very unfortunate event. They sent the message that party affiliation is more important than anything else. By the way, I've criticized the president and those supporting Roy Moore in Alabama for taking the position essentially that party affiliation
Matters
is the
more.
most important characteristic in any individual, which is just wrong. I have friends in the Hispanic caucus. We work together on issues. We've worked together on this Dreamer issue, for example. For them to say, you don't count because you're not a registered Democrat, I think is horrible for the institution of the House, horrible for their caucus, and just sends a horrible message about what the state of our politics is in this country, where someone who, by the way, also happens to look like the stereotypical Hispanic in the United States, and it's not like I'm some tall blonde guy, cannot be granted access to a caucus that is for Hispanic members of Congress because he belongs to the wrong party in the eyes of some.
Just to put a point on that, you can be effective on Hispanic-oriented issues without actually being part of that caucus.
Oh, of course. And what I said was this gives me even more motivation to work harder on these issues because, you know, they've denied me that possibility of being in the room. And we all know how important it is for people to be in the room. Yeah. And by the way, the Congressional Black Caucus has a Republican, Mia Love from Utah, and they say how wonderful it is because they help each other. They work each other on different issues. If the CBC needs something from House leadership, Mia goes and helps them with it. And I could have been that person for the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, but it goes to show that bigotry and discrimination comes from all parts of the political spectrum, and I think we should condemn it all equally.
Otra vez.
Cuando quieran, anytime.
Great to have you always.
Congressman, thank you very much. Great to have you here.
Next up, we take the big news of the week to the round table. Stay tuned.